very warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining us. We're with the OBN Horn of Africa. This is our weekly spotlight talk to OBN show. Today we're going to discuss about the war crime and crime against humanity carried out by TPLF against Ethiopia. And Canadian OBN, an international criminal lawyer, John Silford, is here live to tell us all the crime committed by TPLF. TPLF is terrorizing Ethiopia for about 22 months. And what is your, analysis about this crime which is waged by TPLF?
Thank you so much. Well, my observation is that it is a proxy war organized by the United States against Ethiopia, trying to put into power the former leaders of Ethiopia who were in power for 27 years and who wreaked havoc in the region, mostly at the behest of the United States. And now you're embroiled in a very intense conflict. I have followed the history of the overthrowing of the TPLF and the beginning of the war from November 3rd, 2020, the election of June 2021, and obviously my strongest expertise is on proxy wars, human rights intervention, these types of issues which are used by imperial powers to intervene in the external affairs of a sovereign country. And by the way, I'm not American, I'm Quebecois Canadian. I live in Quebec, Canada, but that's neither here nor there.
Right. Many political critics, including yourself, are saying that TPLF is undertaking a proxy war backed by different states. And what are the indicators of this proxy war?
Well, the proxy war is a common tool used by the United States and the European Union and the Britain, and they've been doing so in many ways since about 1990, if not before. We can't get into the long history of using proxy wars like in Nicaragua in the 80s, but the indication that we have now is that, for example, you had an election and your government won, was it 400 and, I don't have the number of seats, but it's a huge majority of seats, 440 out of 480. I don't have the figures in front of me. And yet, there's been an armed uprising, and the Western powers trump up stories about genocide and human rights. Those are the code words for intervening in the internal affairs. The TPLF has absolutely no sovereign legitimacy in your country now. Your government is sovereign, and Western powers, Europe and the US, are saying that the TPLF is a kind of like an equal negotiator with your government, which is nonsense. You can speak in crude terms. The word nonsense, it's not a very legal term. It's an emotional term. Your country is sovereign, as are other countries in Africa. Your country is extremely important with the situation, its localization in the Horn of Africa, and it's certainly related to Eritrea, who was harassed and warred upon by the previous government. So now, the elements of proxy war that I have observed are related to different types of legislation and processes introduced in Europe and in the United States. I could talk about the Human Rights Commission and Committee and the creation of this committee last, I think it was December 17th. And it had I could talk about that now, and then about the US legislation. Now, this committee was voted, I think it's the 17th of September, no, December last, to create, and it had all kinds of, the term that I use is called do blah blah. You know what blah blah means? Talk, 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 do nothing. They have a long resolution about adopting it, saying they're recognizing the sovereignty of Ethiopia. They recognize that Ethiopia with the had a human rights investigation which ended in June 2021. But then they forget Ethiopian sovereignty and they vote to create a committee which will investigate. And the committee is not based on Ethiopian sovereignty, it's based on Western intervention. Now, the vote at the Human Rights Committee was 21 in favor, 15 against, and 11 abstentions. Now, 15 plus 11 is 26. They had no majority. No African country voted for it, and China and Russia, Cuba, Eritrea voted against. No white country voted against. And the concentration of the votes, of the 21 votes who voted for it, were majority imperial, what you might call former colonial powers, US, Canada. Canada wasn't there, but so this committee had a human rights mandate to intervene. Now, what do they want to talk about? There's many things, human rights. They talk about free access to, mobility. Now, when a country is at war, mobility, you cannot have mobility. Mobility means that soldiers from the north or infiltrators can move around. Obviously, you cannot have mobility when a country is at war. So it's intervening in the internal affairs of your country once again. And it's a very, very, they want to restrict the freedom of movement, humanitarian access. Your country knows better than I do what humanitarian access. I understand from reading that humanitarian vehicles were used and food vehicles were used to transport arms in the north of your country. These are well-known facts, and I'm sure that your country knows more about this than I do. So that's very dangerous, and we have to think back about, it's very important to understand some things about Africa. I know some things about Africa from my work. I worked in Rwanda, and prior to 1994, and during the invasion by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, there was human rights commissions from the West who came and made up all kinds of stories about the Habyarimana government committing genocide, and they didn't even go into the Rwandan Patriotic Front areas. They barely got into them. And these were used to justify the intervention in Rwanda. And how did the Western intervention in Rwanda work out? It was a disaster, right? Whether you call it genocide, I don't accept the term genocide, but it was a horrible situation where hundreds of thousands of people died, and they started getting at each other's throats on the basis of ethnicity. In Burundi, in 2015, the African Union, which was kind of not clear on its thinking, had threatened to send a 5,000-man army. And Burundi said, no, you come, we will fight you. then the African Union backed off and they actually began to play a positive role. So when you give up your sovereignty, you are prey to foreign intervention. And I'm not lecturing your government. I think your government knows. So I'm not trying to be arrogant about, but I'm trying to look at the history of these types of things. So this, I can talk a little bit about the composition of this Human Rights Committee. And originally it had Fatou Bensouda, former prosecutor of the ICC. She was taken off this committee and replaced by a lady whose name is Radhika Kumarasamy. I don't know very much about this woman, and I won't criticize her because it would be inappropriate. However, on this committee, there is Stephen Ratner, and a US professor of international law, and a consultant to the State Department. Let's remember the term State Department, and I'll come back to that when I refer to US legislation, which is presently before the Senate and the House of Representatives. Another woman is Betty Murungu, and this is a Kenyan woman, and this whole human rights industry in the Great Lakes area has been really very hot issue and a subject of propaganda. Betty Murungi was involved in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, monitoring the trials. Now, those trials, because I acted in them, I was a defense lawyer, the major leaders were acquitted, ironically, because there was no evidence. Not everybody, and there were a lot of people unfairly convicted. But she was a consultant to the Rwandan Supreme Court under Paul Kagame, a strong ally of the TPLF. People don't seem to want to talk about the relationship between Rwanda and the TPLF. So we have two people on this committee who are associated either with Rwanda.
The other one is from Sri Lanka.
With Rwanda or with the US State Department. So these are the problems with this Human Rights Committee, and I'll come back to them in a minute. Now, what is the US attitude to this? Well, they have adopted, it's not finalized, it hasn't been fully brought into force, but they want to adopt legislation to intervene in the internal affairs of Ethiopia. This is a neo-colonial effort, and they wanted to insist on the freedom of movement, human rights, access of humanitarian aid to the Tigray region. And they don't think about Ethiopian sovereignty. And what's striking about these is they call on report of a Human Rights Committee making a report to Congress and to the State Department. This is the link between this Human Rights Committee and the US policy. And these are extremely negative dispositions of the law, which constitute a threat to your country.
These three personalities signed by the United Nations Human Rights Commission concluded their first mission to Ethiopia and returned back to Israel. You have been heard that the Ethiopian government shouldn't allow these people to enter to Ethiopia for the investigation. Of course, you have raised your argument. These people are strong allies to the United States, and they are lapdogs. A woman from Kenya, she been to the Rwandan case, genocide case as well. The guy from the US and the one is from Sri Lanka. Still, they are not impartial. But they have concluded their mission in Ethiopia and they went back. How do you see the bargaining power of U.S., though it's not legally correct?
These people, it's your government's decision, not mine. But my own suggestion is they should not be allowed to set their feet in Ethiopia, and they have only a political mission. They do not have a genuine mission in human rights, and any recommendations they made should be not respected by your government. Just a week or so back, they made a public statement about the resumption of hostilities in your country. Since when is a Human Rights Commission allowed to participate in the public debate about the war? They have no right to intervene and make public statements about this war. Their job, if it was true, would be simply to discuss issues of human rights. They're clearly a political mission. So I think it's appropriate for your country to refuse all cooperation with this commission. Your country can judge how to handle this, not me, in what diplomatic manners. And I'd like to refer to the African Union in a minute also, but I'll come back to that in a minute. You will note also that some people are saying, oh, the US is turning friendly towards Ethiopia. Well, a couple of weeks ago, the US ambassador, the EU ambassadors, and Canadian diplomats, I saw it, I was ashamed, I'm Canadian, right? Met the representatives of the TPLF. What diplomatic status does a representative of the TPLF have with respect to ambassadors? Ambassadors have to deal with ambassadorial authorities and not insurgent military organizations. So this is a very worrisome thing.
You said TPLF is undertaking a proxy war, which is backed by the US and the Europeans. Obviously, TPLF used to rule the country with iron feet for about 3 decades. So what is the US plan? Are they going to bring them to power or to destabilize them?
Well, that's what we might call...
TPLF was hosted with popular uprising. The Ethiopians are not going to give a chance for TPLF to govern or to lead the nation now on. So, with what end would the US and other imperialists that TPLF do this proxy or representative war act?
Well, there are different hypotheses which are related to the situation in your country. They would have preferred, I think, the TPLF to take power militarily. It would appear that this is not possible. So they will probably try by all means to weaken your government and allow the TPLF to have some kind of influence in the government in order to weaken your government and have your government turn to the West and to Europe and not to the Eastern direction where in my opinion, the real economic advantages and sovereignty can be respected. And this is a question, everything will be done, I think, to weaken your government, to weaken Mr. Abiy's government, and to try and have Europe and the USA obtain a stronger foothold in the region. The negotiations of the peace negotiations, which I don't fully master, they've now said 4 or 5 days ago they're going to negotiate. About 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, they wanted to have a negotiation. They wanted to have the EU the USA, African Union, Kenya, and Tanzania to be facilitators. Well, the best facilitator is the African Union, which is representative of Africa, which has been acting in a sovereign way for looking out for the interests of Africa. And the TPLF wanted to have the USA and Europe to have a part in the negotiations. And this refers back to the disaster that happened in Rwanda in 1994. The negotiations happened in 92, 93, which led to an abandonment of sovereignty and a war, which, if you look at the history, was a horrible war. And if you look back to Burundi, who acted independently and now has relative peace and an improving economic situation. And, you know, you in Ethiopia, me as a Canadian Quebecois, we want peace. We do not want war. We need respect of the powers for countries' decisions and how they're going to advance. War is the last solution, because when there's war, sometimes it's necessary. I'm not saying it. You can't fight a revolutionary war. You can't fight to resist, but the sovereignty of your country is the highest. With respect to the Horn of Africa, the sovereignty of your country and the avoiding war and making peace and avoiding war with Eritrea is, to me, the highest value, which has to be respected.
What are the major crimes committed by TPLF? Of course, different bodies and different states are accusing TPLF for committing crime against humanity and war crime. Can you drop down those? Can you explicitly tell us what the very first crime was attacking the northern command of Ethiopian military base?
Okay. I have not studied this with the preparation of preparing a brief on the international crimes, but it could be the crime of aggression if it can be proven that they're acting on behalf of a third party. But the crimes there are sexual crimes, I understand, where women are abused, raped by the TPLF soldiers, and it can be linked probably to their commanders. I'm not sure. It's a question of evidence. There are crimes destroying health facilities, destroying food. There's a large number of crimes described in the Geneva Conventions, which, in my opinion, can be used, and they overlap with the Ethiopian criminal code. So Ethiopia has the tools in its own national legislation to charge and punish, if guilty, of course, under fair and public trials, the right to suppress this type of criminality for once and for all. Now, the other crying issue, which keeps coming back at us in international media, is there's a tendency to say, oh, the TPLF and Ethiopia, they're equals. No, they're not equals. One is a rebel force with no legitimacy, and the government is legitimate. So it is up, and we have to really, in my opinion, concentrate on the sovereignty of your country to make peace through the entire country and prevent secession and secession activities. Because, and this is something that you know much more than I do, but your country has a lot of potential. Now you have a tremendous agricultural base. You have now electricity. You have industrial capacity, which has been hindered by the US sanctions. And you have a lot of potential. And your country is very populous. I've never been in your country. I'd like to come. But it's a very populous country. And your country has a responsibility to its people to increase its living standards, which are probably a bit too low. I'm sure that there's too much poverty in your country. I'm not criticizing your country when I say that. But Africa has a wonderful future if the West stops intervening in it.
The federal government of Ethiopia used to call the warring parties for peace negotiations, but TPLF chose to carry out a war than talking around itself. What is your analysis about it?
We can be sad, but we can note that it's now necessary to win the war. In other words, it's I think it's your government, if they can't negotiate with the TPLF, then they have to defeat them militarily. And that's my assessment. And it's been that since I've been following the war closely for about a year now. And among our friends and discussions, unfortunately, the military option is the only one left, because negotiations seem not possible. That is your government's call, not mine, because they can tell. But you will, you can study, and your government can study the negotiations in Rwanda under the auspices of the foreign parties, when in that case, the Paul Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front was strong, and the Rwandan government had a shortage of arms. And what happened is the RPF would fight, then they'd stop fighting, they'd try and negotiate, and they used the period of negotiation to advance and encircle and advance in the country, and then they started fighting again. So the negotiations were used by the insurgent force, the illegal force, to advance. It's your government's call and not mine. I can't evaluate military options, of course, but it may be the tactic of the TPLF to try and negotiate and gain time and then start shooting again. But that's not my call. Have to be, military issues are the issues are your government has to decide, your army has to decide politically and militarily what's the best solution. But one thing to evaluate, which they can consider, and I'm sure they are considering it, is it right to go all the way and win militarily? I tend to lean that way, but it would be presumptuous of me to make such a statement as if I know.
Okay.
Because I'm not a military man. I don't know how to use a gun. I can, anyway, you understand, and I think our listeners understand that it's a sovereign decision of your government.
Those three personalities assigned by the UN to investigate the humanitarian situation in Ethiopia are not impartial, as you have alluded a while ago. So, what ought to be done by Ethiopian government now on? Because they have done the first mission.
Yes.
And they went back on August 2, 2022.
Yes.
Putin heard saying the Ethiopian government should not allow them to enter into Ethiopia to investigate the happening. What ought to be done by Ethiopian government now on?
Well, my reading of it is that they should. My reading of it is that they should not allow them back in. That's my own observation, and for many reasons. They have certainly seen that they're not fair, they've also seen they made a public statement about the war, criticizing the war, and that's not their duty. They have nothing to say about whether you fight or not. If you read their mandate, it's all blah, 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 human rights, women's rights. All these things are important, but they forget the fundamental issue of human rights is national sovereignty. And the lawyers and jurists and human rights experts should look back at the International Covenant on civil and political rights and social and economic rights. The first article says national sovereignty is the primary human right. And by the way, how can you guarantee human rights if you don't have a government? So this is a distortion of the human rights principles. And you are younger than I am, but if you look back at the history of the United Nations, when they fought for human rights, before human rights became a dictum of the West to intervene, they all stated that human rights are based on the exercise of national sovereignty. These are all things you can look up on the internet. Look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Sovereignty is the first issue. And so if you look at the mandate of the Human Rights Committee, they don't even talk about, they're not respecting Ethiopian sovereignty, even though at the beginning they say blah, 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 we favor it. They still want to override it.
Canadian international criminal lawyer John Kilford, thank you for your time and thank you for giving us this insight. We appreciate you on behalf of this media.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to meet you again, and I hope that we can maybe meet in person one day.